it may seem like a redundancy to simply say that to be honored, to be an honoree for Furious Flower 4 is an honor. Um, and I have to explain a little bit about the nature of that honor. Furious Flower, amongst very few organizations, has come to represent something massively important for the understanding of African American poetry, poetry of Africa and the diaspora in the United States. And this has been the case in this unlikely phenomena of a 10-year conference, a conference that happens every 10 years. I've been able to attend a number of those conferences, and one of the sensations of being at that conference has been the sensation of being amongst writers that I've come to admire, that I've valued, that I've regarded as people whose work I spent a lot of time studying and paying attention to, and in many ways, writers who gave me permission um, to consider myself a writer writing out of that space that recognizes the complex cultural milieu that represents who I am. But the honor is deeply personal in the sense that um, that my own personal narrative, which has global implications, I think, is one in which the sense of uprooting, belonging, of planting, welcome, have been themes that have constantly been a part of my own sense of self and my own sense of my work as a poet. I was born in Ghana, in West Africa, and grew up there. And then moved to the Caribbean. I moved to Jamaica, where I also grew up and went to school and studied there. And then from there, traveled to North America. I was in Canada for a number of years, and of course, I lived in South Carolina. And each of these landings, whether it's to the UK, to the Caribbean, and so on, have been landings in which there's this disease of arrival, and yet there is the finding of home space through the openness of art and artists and individuals in the welcoming of me. One of the great moments for me was the 20 years I spent living with family in South Carolina, with my family in South Carolina, and the way in which the black community, the African American community, welcomed me as a human being, as a person that was connected to a long history of diaspora and arrival and creativity. I first went to Furious Flower during that time of, of, of discovery of a sense of place and connectivity. And Furious Flower welcomed me as a person, as an African writer, as a Caribbean writer, as a voice that became then part of the fabric of what we call Black writing, African American writing, and work of the African diaspora, which I think has always been at the heart of Furious Flower. And so to be named as an honoree in that regard represents yet another kind of homecoming and a kind of a caregiving welcome, which I value tremendously. And what is fascinating about this welcoming is that when you are honored in any way, one of course realizes the value of that honor by those who have received such an honor in the past, and it's a fantastic list of writers who have been honored in this way through Furious Flower. And then to be beside somebody this year who I've come to admire so much, somebody we laughingly call ourselves age mates, but somebody whose work has been at the basis of any kind of idea of the development of African American poetry, any idea of the ways in which we are starting to engage poetry in this moment, and in retrieving and restoring the legacy of the African American experience and the Black experience in generally, namely Elizabeth Alexander. And this is just for her poetry and her writing, which has been generous, insightful, bold, in a spirit that comes from her own family tradition that extends deep into the idea of America, but even deeper, further down into even the Caribbean. There are points of connection that are beautifully articulated in her vision and in the clarity in which she engages this world. Elizabeth Alexander is easily understood to be a giant voice, not just for her work as an artist, but of course for her incredible work in transforming the landscape of the literary arts and the culture of America through her role with the Mellon Foundation and her leadership and that work. So to be named beside Elizabeth Alexander and to be able to share this with her strikes me as one of the high points of this honor. And it does make me think then of this idea of the theme of this year's Furious Flower, which is Worlds of Black Poetry. In a sense, it only makes sense to me, and one can imagine that as I sort of rehearsed earlier, I understand myself to be a writer who comes from multiple worlds that do not lead to disquiet or dis-ease, but actually lead to a sense of wholeness. That the multiplicity of voices, whether it's voices from different parts of the world, whether it's aesthetics and poetics from different parts of the world that come through this fulcrum that we call Blackness and Black identity, whether it's an identity we embrace and hold on to, or an identity that has been constructed out of an imposition, and yet a transformative blues-like transformation of that imposition into something beautiful and affirming and protective. That idea seems to be contained in this notion of worlds of Black poetry, but the worlds are also aesthetically varied. African poetry, poetry of the African diaspora, poetry of African American experience, Black poetry has been varied in its constant effort to address our living present in the world, to affirm our existence in the world. That goes all the way back into antiquity, and that comes into this present moment. So worlds of, and of course that looks through the future, the imagined future, the capacity to imagine the future. So that theme strikes me as descriptive but also prescriptive in the ways in which we approach our poetry with generosity and care and a recognition of the multiple voices that make up this thing called Black poetry. So what I'm looking forward to is always very interesting at this conference, because of course I'm looking forward to being with the family of poets, people who are interested in poetry, driven by poetry, and people who are trying to make poetry. One of the fascinating things about these conferences is that when you attend, as an attendee, I remember that feeling, especially as a writer who was just starting to try and find your way in this business. There's this nervous energy, this anxiety, this sense of wondering, do I belong, or will I be welcomed, and so on. And there's that hunger, that tension that is there, which is not necessarily a lovely thing, but something does happen the moment we start to hear poems, the moment we start to hear the songs being sung, the moment we start to evoke and invoke the ancestry of our poetry, the legacy of our poetry, there's something that generates a sense, a drive to want to make work, a drive to want to be among those who I like to call the chroniclers of the sentiment of our time, our space, our land, our identity, our place. And that energy, I think, is what I'm looking forward to witnessing and to be part of the idea of how we sharpen each other by our openness to hearing each other's voices being sung and being spoken. And so I'm really looking forward to that sensation at the conference. This is a tremendous honor, and I hope it will be for everybody else.